Welcome to our November program. It's entitled Out in the Coal Patch, a life in the coal mining towns of western Pennsylvania.
People say a man is made out of mud. A poor man's made out of muscle and blood. Muscle and blood and skin and bones. A mind that's weak and a back that's strong. You load the 16 tons. What do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
Everyone knows that Pittsburgh is well known for its steel industry, but another industry that was just as important was the coal industry. And it was the coal industry that provided the energy for the steel industry. And 100 years ago, western Pennsylvania was home to a number of small villages that were referred to as coal patches. So before we talk about the coal mining communities, I just wanted to give you a brief description of different methods of mining. And there are basically four types. Surface mining, which is strip mining, and that's for coal that is near the surface. And what they do is just go in with shovels and dig it out. The other type is what they call a drift mine. And that's when the coal vein is exposed on the side of a hill. And what they do is just dig back into the hill. A slope mine is similar to a drift mine, only you can see it sort of slopes down into the coal vein. And the one that we're all familiar with, if you grew up in western Pennsylvania, is what we call a shaft mine. And that's whenever they drill down to the coal vein, which is usually located anywhere from 200 to 500 feet below the surface. So those are the four types of mining that occurred here in western Pennsylvania. The first mining occurred in 1760. Captain Thomas Hutchins of the British Army visited Fort Pitt, and he reported that coal was being mined on the hill across the river from the fort. And what they would do, they would dig drift mines back into the face of Mount Washington. At the time, Mount Washington was known as Coal Hill because there were so many drift mines back into the hill. So they would bring the coal out, and they built large wooden chutes that went down to the floor of the valley. And they would dump the coal down these chutes. And once it got down by the river, they would gather it in bushel baskets and then load it into canoes and boats and carry it across the Mon River to Fort Pitt. By 1830, Pittsburgh was consuming 400 tons of coal per day. And most of that was used in the glass industry. Types of coal uses in Pennsylvania: the first was for colonial iron furnaces and glass works. Then, after the Civil War, coal was used primarily in the steel industry. And today, coal is used to generate electric. Now, Pittsburgh is famous for the meeting point of the three rivers. However, it's also the meeting point of three coal seams. You have the Pittsburgh seam, and that runs southwest into West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. You have the Connellsville seam, which runs east out into Westmoreland and Fayette counties. And we have the Freeport seam. The Freeport seam follows the path of the Allegheny River north. And we here are a part of the Freeport seam. And this is a map that shows you the Freeport coal field. And if you can see all the red dots there, those are mines that were once in the Freeport coal field. You can see New Kensington, that gives you a focal point, and then you can see all the different mines. So that shows you how many mines were in this area. As I said, this is a very rich area for coal. Over 21 billion tons have been mined over the past 200 years here in Pennsylvania. That accounts for 25% of all the coal that's mined in the country. In the late 1800s, we saw the rise of the steel industry. And because of that, large amounts of coal were needed for the steel industry. And after the Civil War, technology had improved to a point where they were able to search for coal deeper down in the ground. And that's when we saw an increase in the number of the shaft mines. Now, coal mining, like steel, is a very labor-intensive industry. You need a lot of people to work it. And whenever they built the steel mills, they could more or less choose where they wanted to build the mills. They needed close to transportation, close to their suppliers, and importantly, they needed close to a population center because they had people to work in the mills. However, with coal, they had to go where the coal was. So in most cases, almost all cases, the coal was discovered out in the rural areas. So being out in the rural areas, there were no population, there was no infrastructure. So it was up to the coal companies to provide all that before they could go into business. So what they would do, upon choosing a site of where they were going to have their coal mine, the first thing they had to do was begin to sink the shaft, and that was dig the hole. Because they were out in the country, they would have to build a rail line to transport the coal to market. So as a result, they would have to build a railroad. They would have to recruit workers, and then they would have to provide a place for those workers to live. So what they did, the coal companies sent agents to Europe, primarily Eastern Europe and Italy. And they would go into the small towns and villages that were very poor, and they would recruit men to come and work in the coal mines. And they would have the agent recruit them. Then they would send them off to the port of deportation. And at the port, they would have another agent there who would make sure that the prospective miner got on the correct ship to come to America. Once he arrived in New York and was processed through Ellis Island, they would have another agent who would make sure that the man got on the correct train to get to his destination. And then whenever he got here in Pittsburgh, they would have another agent that would make sure he got from Pittsburgh out to Renton, Harmarville, Harwick, wherever he was going to be working. As I said, they had to build a company town. They had to provide housing for their workers. The houses were very basic. They were all uniform. And they used, a lot of the houses are what they call a 2 up and 2 down. That meant they had 2 rooms downstairs and 2 rooms upstairs. The houses were just shelter. They had usually a stove for heat and cooking. There was no electricity, gas, or water. It was shelter. What they would do is they would drill wells out along the street, every so many houses, and people would go out there for their water. You can see here there's an outhouse out back here that they used, and this is how they lived. It was usually, these houses were built on the less desirable land. And you can see this is a mining town in West Virginia, and you can see it's right along the train tracks there. They had to put up with the noise of the train tracks. If you go across the river over in Harmarville, those houses on Freeport Road at the end of the Halton Bridge, those were the company houses for the Harmarville mine. 100 years ago, the Allegheny River wasn't as clean as it is today. It was basically an open sewer. Everything was dumped in there. They had the railroad that ran right past their back doors, so that's why they built the houses out there. There was a hierarchy in the houses. The laborers all had houses like that. They were all similar. Now, different coal patches had different types of housings. If you went over to Harmarville and you go up Guys Run Road, you can see those brick row houses. That's what they had there. If you go further out to Indianola, you see they had bungalows, small little cottages. If you go out to Renton, you will see that they had duplexes. So there were different types, but they were all the same. And as I said, there was a hierarchy. So laborers lived in the basic houses. You had people in the mine like the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the electricians. They were the tradesmen. So they got a little nicer house. They may have a house further away from the railroad tracks, further away from the mine. They might have a yard, a little bit of area. So they got nicer houses because they were the tradesmen. And then you had the management, the mine superintendent, the managers, the bosses. They had the nice big houses out on the main road, away from the mine, away from the dirt and grime of the mine. So there was this separate setup in how all the houses worked. In addition to building the houses, they had to build roads, because you look at somewhere like Plum Township. 100 years ago, Plum Borough was Plum Township, and it was pretty much just a rural area. They had no infrastructure out there. They had some country roads. So the coal mining company came in. They built their roads, their streets, their sidewalks. They would build parks, and oftentimes they would build schools for the children. They would provide a company doctor. Now, the doctor was for the workers, but he also took care of the families. If the children got sick, he took care of everybody in town. So they provided everything that they needed for the miners and their families. Even though they provided it for them, they still had to pay rent. The rent for the houses were deducted from their pay every pay period. So they weren't able to live for free. And that money that they paid in rent went right back to the coal companies. Now, the center of activity in all coal towns was the company store. The company store supplied everything that the miners needed, all the necessities, clothing, food. It was said you could buy everything from diapers to dynamite in the company store. And literally, the miners did have to purchase their own dynamite when they went down in the mine. The mine did not supply tools, they did not supply helmets or anything like that, and blasting caps, they had to buy all that out of their pay, which when they got paid, went to the company store, bought it, and the money went right back to the coal companies. And I'm sure you've all heard the song by Tennessee Ernie Ford, "I owe my soul to the company store," and that was reality for the miners, because they had to get everything from the company store. This is a picture of an interior of a company store. You can see the food in the back. You can see the rack of clothing, personal effects on the right there. Whatever you needed, you could buy at the company store. And they wanted to keep their workers in town. They didn't want them spending their money. If they lived in Harmarville, they didn't want them to come over to Oakmont to shop here. They would have them spend all their money at the company store. A lot of times the work went down. There would be times when they would be laid off and they wouldn't get paid. So what they would do is buy on credit at the company store, and it was called buying on tick. And they kept an account for everything you needed. And then when you went back to work, they deducted the money. So you never got out from under what you owed at the store. Some of the mine companies went as far as, rather than pay in money, they paid in what they called script. And this is more or less, I guess you would call it monopoly money. It was only good at the company store. And so again, that's how they got paid. This is from the Deer Creek Mercantile Company over in Indianola. And this was good only at their store. They got paid, they went right back, gave it back to the mine company. So it was just a cycle they couldn't get out of. Over in Harmarville, they had a company store right at the end of the bridge. And right next to that was the Eaton Brothers garage. And Jim Eaton said that they were allowed to accept, I think he said $90 a month in coal script for any coal miners that may have needed their car repaired or gas or something like that. And then the company would reimburse Eaton's for that. But eventually the union and the government stepped in and said, no, you can't do this anymore. You have to pay these people in real money. That's an overview of what it was like to live in the company town. Now we'll take a look at what it was like to work in the coal mine. Coal mining is probably the most dangerous profession of all. Back in the day, I mean, it's a lot safer now, but it's still very dangerous. But the laborers would work 10-hour days, 6 days a week. They were paid by the amount of coal that they mined. And at the end of each shift, they would have to go to the scale man. And the scale man weighed their coal and paid them accordingly. Now, he was probably the most despised person in town because he cheated them every time. If they mined a ton of coal, he would pay them for 80% and say the other was dirty coal. which meant it had rocks or shale in it. So he was always, cheating them out of their pay that they were paid. This was before they went to an hourly rate. They were paid on how much they had mined. The veins were usually anywhere from 3 to 5 feet high. In this bottom picture, you can see the miners laying on their sides with their picks. Some of them had to actually lay down and chip away at the coal. They often worked in water. And after the mines got established and there were a lot of people there, they had a problem with rats. So rats were always scurrying around the mine. They said that sometimes in the winter, these miners would go into work at 6 a.m. and work till 6 p.m. They would go in before the sun came up and come out after it went down. And they would go for a week and not see any daylight. The only time they would see daylight is on Sunday when they had one day off. In the early days, they used mules to pull carts around the mine. The mules were kept down in the mine. They actually hollowed out stables where they kept the mules. And they fed them, watered them. Mules were probably valued more by the mining companies than the miners themselves. If a miner mistreated a mule, he would be fired on the spot. My great-grandfather was the blacksmith over at the Harmer mine. So one of his responsibilities was to go down and shoe the mules when they needed new shoes. And he told stories that mules are very intelligent and very stubborn. And if a mule didn't like a certain miner, he wouldn't work. He wouldn't pull the cart. And there were mules that liked some miners and didn't like others. So what a lot of miners had to do were bribe them. And they would bring in apples or carrots and slip them to them. But he said there was one mule that liked chewing tobacco. And what they would do is they would get a big wad of tobacco and open the mule and stick it in his lip, and the mule would go on his way. But for the most part, these mules lived their entire lives in the mine. They would bring them up to graze occasionally, but they would have to do it at night because their eyes couldn't take the bright sunlight. So they were a very valuable part of mining until the electric trains came in, and then they were able to do away with the mules. Another animal that was important was the canary. And I'm sure you've probably heard the term the canary in the coal mine. Before they had the detectors that could detect poisonous gases, miners would take a canary down like this in a small cage and set it beside them as they worked. Reason being, if there was ever black damp or poisonous gas and the oxygen level dropped, the canary would faint and fall off its perch. And that's how the miner knew that he had to get out. And so for many years, they would take their canaries and go down with their lunch pails and their canaries and would go down and dig in the coal mine. And it saved many a coal miner's lives. As I said, mining is probably the most dangerous job that there is out there. This was in 1933, 7 died in the Oakmont mine blast. How many people knew that there was an Oakmont mine? A couple of people. The Oakmont mine was located along the Allegheny River between Oakmont and New Kensington, up near where the dam is, just above there. You've probably heard the term, the town Barking, if you've heard of Barking. Well, that was the Oakmont mine. There was a buildup of methane, some type of sparked it, and there was an explosion, and 7 miners died in that accident. That was September of 1933. Now, every mine had a steam whistle that they used to signal the start of a shift. So when the miners were getting ready, they would blast the whistle. They knew that the shift was starting, time to go down in the mine. Anytime there was an accident in the mine that was serious, they would just blow the whistle, one long continual blast. And that meant trouble in the mine. Now, people in the town, when they heard that long continual blast, they knew trouble in the mine. Everyone there had either a husband, a son, a brother, a nephew, uncle, grandfather working in the mine. So as soon as they heard that blast, everyone would drop what they were doing and run to the mine because they wanted to find out if their loved one was okay. This is a picture from that day in 1933, and you can see the people gathered around the mine waiting on word of their family members who were down in the mine. They would wait until the miners were rescued or brought out. This is another picture from the Oakmont mine. So you can see all the people gathered there, and there on the right-hand side is the casket that they're bringing out, loading into the hearse. And they would wait there. In the earlier days, they had what they called Black Maria. Anybody ever hear that term? Black Maria was a black wagon. It could be a hearse like that, or just a black buckboard wagon. But any time someone died in the mine as a result of the accident, Black Maria would come. They would put the body in the wagon. All the townspeople who were gathered there would follow the wagon in a large procession back to the miner's house. He was taken inside and laid out in the living room and buried from the living room. And so that was always something that somebody dreaded. Now this was more prevalent out in the anthracite coal fields, but you did have it here in western Pennsylvania. Now the other thing that's interesting, if a miner was disabled or killed in the mine, his family had 30 days to vacate the company house. So a lot of times you had young women lost their husbands. They may have 4 or 5 children at home. They had 30 days and they had to leave because they wanted someone who was going to work the mines. So what would happen was, if you had somebody from Italy that came here to work in the mines, or let's say Slovakia, something like that, the husband was killed, the wife now has to leave. She's never been anywhere but the company town if she came from Europe. She knows nothing about the culture outside of the coal mining town. So what would happen is, if a young man, single man from Slovakia came to work at the mine, he might be living in a boarding house, they would marry. And they would marry without often knowing each other. It might be in a period of a week. He would find out that so-and-so died, his wife was now a widow. He would propose. They would get married without even knowing each other. But it was a marriage of convenience, of necessity, because at that point, the wife could stay in her house. The children could stay in the house. And this young man now had a wife to cook, clean, prepare his lunches, wash his clothes. And that's what happened a lot of times whenever someone died in the mine. Sometimes it worked out, other times it didn't. So, it was what happened when people died in the mine. Now, as I said, my great-grandfather was the blacksmith over at Harmerville. As a result, they had a nicer home. And if you go up Guys Run Road, you've probably seen those row houses there on Guys Run. If you go up towards the end, there's some bungalows that are up there. They're single-family homes. Well, that's where the tradesmen live, the millwrights, the electricians, the blacksmith. Now, as I said, my grandfather was the blacksmith. He had 3 sons that lived with him. My grandfather and his 2 brothers all were miners, worked in the mine. And even though they worked in the mine company went to my great-grandmother and said, you have to leave because you don't have any blacksmiths here now. We have to give this house to the blacksmith. So they gave her the option. She could move to the row houses over near the Halton Bridge, and that's what they did. So there was always turnover. If you weren't able to produce, you had to leave. Probably the worst mining disaster occurred right across the river in Harwick. Are you all familiar with where Harwick is? It's up on the top of the hill there where the expressway cuts through, right by the Sirius Center there, the Shriner Center. That's Harwick. Well, on January 25th, 1904, gas exploded in the mine, and 181 workers died in the blast. They said that the blast was so strong that the steel tipple folded like lace. It was just all curled up. There was a mule at the bottom of the shaft. He was blown up the shaft and 200 feet into the air. They said that the ground cracked above the explosion. That's how forceful it was. The public collected $40,000. People in western Pennsylvania collected $40,000 to donate to the families of these miners. Now, $40,000 in 1904 is quite a bit of money, and that's how much money was raised. Andrew Carnegie was so moved by this that he donated an additional $40,000 for the family. So they had $80,000. Now, a lot of volunteers arrived on the scene, and there were two men that came to try to help out. One was named Selwyn Taylor. He was from Pittsburgh, and a Daniel Lau from Castle Shannon. Taylor was a mining engineer, and Lau was a miner. And so they volunteered to go down into the mine to see if they could rescue anyone. And they went down, and they found one man who was injured, still alive. And they were able to get him over and get him up out of the mine. However, they were overcome by the gas, and both of those men died. So once again, Andrew Carnegie heard of this, and because of that, you may have heard of this, he established the Carnegie Hero Fund. And he set aside a $5 million endowment, and that is awarded to ordinary citizens who perform heroic deeds. And it's given worldwide at this point, but it had its start here in Harwick during the Harwick mine explosion. Many of the miners, they were able to get everybody out, but unfortunately some of them they weren't able to identify, so they were buried in a mass grave over in the Springdale Cemetery. There's a large monument to them over there. Well, 34 years later, there was another explosion in the Harwick mine. This time, 10 miners were killed. The mine had been shut down that day. Normally, there would have been close to 600 miners in the mine. They shut it down to perform some maintenance. There was a buildup of poisonous gas and it exploded. There were about 45 men in there. 35 were able to escape, but 10 of them were not. One of the men who was in the mine was a gentleman by the name of Frank Cizelski. And he lived at Harwick with his wife Mary, and they had 5 children: Walter, Stella, Eddie, Rose, and the youngest was a boy named Tony, who was 13 years old. When he heard the siren went off, the steam whistle went off, he was in school, and he heard the steam whistle. He knew there was trouble at the mine, and he knew that his father was in the mine that day. So he ran to the mine, trying to find word that his father had made it out. Unfortunately, he was told his father was trapped in the mine and wasn't able to escape. They said that he sat in the superintendent's office for over 24 hours, would not eat, would not sleep, would not drink anything until he got word that his father was okay. Unfortunately, his father died in the explosion, and he was one of the last men that they were able to pull out. What's interesting is, the night before, Frank's wife, named Mary, had a dream, a bad dream. And she felt it was a premonition, and she begged him not to go to work that day. He did, and he died. Frank Cizelski is the grandfather of our friend Ron Cecil. We know Ron, who's a member of the Historical Society. And so it was his grandfather that died in the mine explosion. So, you know, that does touch, you know, everybody in one way or another. There's these mine accidents. And this is an article that they wrote about this Tony Cizelski waits all night for daddy, dead in blast. The Pittsburgh Press featured this article that they ran about the story. I read another account of a lady who, she was elderly when she wrote it, but she grew up in Harmerville. And she talked about the greatest fear in the coal mining town is when the steam whistle would go off. And she said that it happened many times while they were in school. And after the whistle would stop, they would hear footsteps come down the hall. And it was the principal coming to tell a certain child that his father was in the mine. And she said she used to hear the steps come down the hall, and she would pray, keep walking, don't stop at my room, because they were so afraid that it might have been her father. And she said that was a terrible fear that children had growing up in coal mining towns. So another important part of coal mining and the coal mining towns were labor disputes. Miners worked under terrible conditions for very little money, and it took them years, but they were finally able to fight the coal companies and gain better working conditions, better pay, and it was a battle between the coal companies and the unions. But the first major strike occurred in 1892. 180,000 miners walked off the job in 5 states after wages were cut 30%. On May 23rd, 1,500 miners marched on a mine near Uniontown. The guards opened fire and killed 5 of them. 8 were wounded. The coal strike lasted 8 weeks, and nothing was really accomplished. Now, during this strike, there were 3 mines out in the Penn Hills Plum area. There was the Unity Mine, the Oak Hill Mine, and the Sandy Creek Mine. And they were under the supervision of a mine superintendent by the name of Alex DeArment. And he ran his mines with a steel fist. And he told the men, if you go on strike, I will fire you all and I will bring in replacement workers. And so they were afraid of him. And even though, as I said, 180,000 miners were off the job, it was pretty much the whole mining industry. DeArment's 3 mines kept working because they were afraid to take a chance and be fired. So as a result, all these miners from over western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, would come out to the mine at Unity, Sandy Creek, and Oak Hill and protest and picket. And it was almost like a party atmosphere, because they would come and they would bring their families and they would camp in a farm. They would find a farmer who would let them camp there, and they would set up camp. And a lot of these coal mining towns had brass bands. And so they would march around and they would play their bands and everything. And there was this one story I read in the newspaper that said that they all went to the Unity Mine, and the brass band came and they were playing outside the gate. And Mr. DeArment just got tired of it, so they had a train, a locomotive, sitting in the yard. So he ordered the engineer to start just blasting the train whistle. So every time the band would start to play, he would just blast the train whistle and drown out the band, and the band would try to drown out the train. But yeah, as I said, that strike lasted 8 weeks, and nothing happened. Another strike occurred in 1910. And it was referred to as the Slovak Strike of 1910. And on March 9th, 1910, the miners at the Keystone Coal Mine in Westmoreland County went out on strike after wages were reduced by 16%. In addition to that, the government had imposed new regulations as far as helmets and lighting and safety equipment, and they had to implement that, and the mine companies told the miners that they had to buy that equipment on their own. So between that and the requirements, they went on strike. Well, originally 400 miners worked off the job, and right away 100 were immediately fired. After that, the strike spread to 65 mines in the region, and 15,000 miners went on strike. The coal companies went to the court and asked for an injunction to evict striking miners from their homes. So the union set up tent cities outside of the coal mining towns, and that's where they lived. 16 miners were killed in the violence. And this is a newspaper headline from the Pittsburgh Press that talks about the oppression of the miners here. And it was a very political a lot of controversy, pro and con, against the miners. Now, during this strike, a lady by the name of Mary Harris Jones showed up. Does anybody know who Mary Harris Jones is? Somebody say Mother Jones? Mother Jones, yeah. You probably heard of Mother Jones magazine. She was a union organizer back at the turn of the century. And anytime there was a strike, she would come and she would organize the women, support the women and children during the strike. So she said that the women should go picket at the mine gates, which they did. Well, the coal companies were in with the Westmoreland County Sheriff. He arrived on the scene and he arrested the women and charged them with disorderly conduct and inciting a riot. Mother Jones told them, go to the hearing in Greensburg, and when you go, take your children with you. So they did. And they were found guilty. And the judge said to them, 30 days in jail or $30. Well, they were poor, they didn't have $30. So he sent them to jail. Well, they had their children with them, no one to watch the children, so the children went to jail with the mothers. Jones said, don't worry, I will bring milk, I will bring fruit for the children. But she said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to sleep during the day and stay up all night and sing. Sing as loud as you can. Sing happy songs, sing sad songs, sing one at a time, sing as a group, but don't stop singing all night. And that's what they did. And by the third night, the Westmoreland County Sheriff, who lived next to the jail, and the neighbors had had enough and let them go. So, so the strike again ended. Not a whole lot was resolved. And some of the miners were fired. They had to leave the area. If they worked for a certain company that owned multiple mines, they would be blacklisted. They couldn't work, so they would have to leave the area completely and maybe go to West Virginia, Ohio, or Kentucky to find work. Now, if you lived in a coal mining town, the other thing that you paid attention to were what they called the coal police. Has anybody heard of the coal police? Okay, coal police. Originally, the coal police were guards that were hired by the mining companies to guard the mines. Now remember, the coal mining towns were private property. These towns were built on coal mining property. Again, like I said, Plum Borough, Plum Township 100 years ago had no police force. They had a constable, but he didn't want to be bothered with all these immigrant miners. You know, he didn't want any parts of that. So if there was any trouble in the town, say somebody drank too much, somebody got in a fight, some vandalism, the coal police would handle it. You know, if somebody was drunk, they'd get them home. And they more or less kept order in the coal patches. What happened though, as we saw the conflict between labor and management, these coal police transformed into thugs, strike breakers. They worked for the coal companies. So if there were miners picketing, the coal police would hire someone to go into their picket lines and incite trouble, start a fight. And then they would come in and just beat everybody with clubs, things like that. They had no Miranda rights, anything like that. Oftentimes what they would do, if somebody, miner was causing problems, they would throw them in a warehouse, in a garage at the mine for 2 or 3 days, and no accounting for what they would do. During strikes, you weren't allowed in or out of the town unless you had a pass that lets you get around. If there were more than 3 or 4 miners, say they were just talking on a street corner, the coal police would come and scatter them because they said you're involved in union activities. They had the right to burst into the house for no reason, just to make sure there was no union organizing going on. And so it was they really turned into an intimidating factor. And you can see by these pictures, the one guy has an ammunition belt slung across his shoulder there. They were always on horses, and they really inflicted terror in the people in the coal mining towns. It was said that during one strike down in Logan's Ferry, the coal mining town is up on the hill, and they said they surrounded the coal mining town with barbed wire fence to keep people in, keep people out. And some of the old timers, I don't know if it's true, but I heard them say that they had actually set up machine guns at the entrance. There was one road up in there. They set up guards with machine guns there just to keep order. There was another large strike. This one occurred April 1st, 1927. 200,000 miners went out on strike. The strike lasted throughout the summer. There was really no movement on any side. Well, in October, the coal companies went to a judge, a state judge here in western Pennsylvania, and they asked for an injunction that if these miners did not return to work, they had the right to evict them from the company housing. They also received permission that they were allowed to confiscate their personal belongings and auction them off for any back rent that was owed to them. So winter was approaching. They started to be evicted. And so what they did, the mine workers union sent out supplies, and they built what they called barracks. And you can see these were the barracks at Renton. Pretty much just shacks, 4 walls. They said that they insulated them with old newspaper, old rags, whatever they could find. Some of them had a coal stove in the middle. But they would build these. There was a farmer by the name of Miller who lived near Renton, and he gave them permission to build the barracks here. And this is where the miners lived for the remainder of the strike. The union sent out rice and beans and things like that for them to eat, and that's where they lived until the strike was over. There were barracks in Harmer, there were barracks in Russellton, out in Renton, and that's how they survived the winter, in these barracks. There was a gentleman in New Kensington. He was a real estate agent, businessman. His name was Fred Broad. And his mother-in-law was a lady by the name of Fannie Mae Sellens. If you've ever been up to New Kensington, past the cemetery up on the hill, there's one of those historical markers with Fannie Mae Sellens on it. What she was a union organizer. And she came in 1919 and helped out a strike up in Natrona Heights at a coal mine. And she was a troublemaker. I mean, she was instigating, and the coal police shot her and murdered her. And so, as a result, she was honored for her union organizing. Well, Fred Broad learned of what was going on in these coal towns about these auctions and how they were auctioning off these miners' personal effects. So he went to Harmerville on the day of the auction, and he spent $9,400 buying back the miners' possessions, and then he gave them back to them. He went to Russellton, the Republic mine, spent $7,500. He then went to Renton, Curtisville, Kinloch, and Harwick, bought back all of the miners' belongings and gave them back. They said he spent $31,000 of his own money buying back all the miners' possessions. And he never asked for any money back. But a lot of the miners did pay him back. It took them a while, but they were able to pay him back. 11 months in the barracks, the strike ended, and they were able to go back into the company houses. But had it not been for these barracks, they really wouldn't have had anywhere to live during the winter months. I know I've sort of painted a gloomy picture here. It was a hard life. I mean, no doubt about it. But these coal miners and their family were very resilient people, very positive. They had all this adversity, but yet they were living the American dream. They came here. They were working. And they constantly fought to make things better in the mine for their children who would be working in the mine. And the other thing that kept them going is they knew that their children would do better. Their children had a chance. They were receiving educations, high school. Some even had a chance at college, and this is something they would have never had in their home countries. So, they did have a hard life, but yet they just kept at it and tried to make things better. And so they did have other interests. And one of the things that they were very serious about was their sports. All of these coal mining teams had some type of sports. Most all of them had baseball teams, some had basketball. Harmer had a soccer team. Renton had a baseball team, and I read an article that said they played, there was a school in Pittsburgh, a church, Catholic church in Pittsburgh, that came out to Renton on the train to play them in baseball. Well, I guess Renton had a pretty good team, and this team from Pittsburgh beat them. Well, when they went to go home, the players from Renton ran to the train station and wouldn't let them get on the train until they came back and played them again. They wanted a chance to beat them. Over in Harmerville, some of you may remember, they were known for their soccer team. In 1956, the Harmer team won the U.S. Open Cup in Chicago. A group of coal miners, young coal miners. They had a chance to go to Europe to compete further. But as I said, they were poor. They had no money and they really didn't have a sponsor, so they weren't able to go to Europe. This picture here, they were featured in Sports Illustrated. They did an article on them. You can see the Harmer coal mine in the background. But what they were known for, the other picture, they played in the snow. And they used coal dust to mark the field. And that's what they're showing there, how they use the coal dust to mark the field. Logan's Ferry. They had a lot of social organizations in these coal mining towns. Logan's Ferry was known for their Button Box Club. They traveled all over eastern United States to perform. They were a group of accordionists and saxophones and well known. They've cut a couple records, and these were all basically coal miners who did this on the side. They formed organizations. The SNPJ, which is the Slovenian National Benefit Society. Most towns had an Italian-American club, Polish Falcons. So they did have an active social life, even though they worked so hard. Religion was another important part of the coal mining community. Most cases, the coal companies would donate a portion of ground that they could use for a church. And since most of the people were Eastern Europe, Italian heritage, almost every coal mining town has a Catholic church. They're all very small. If you've been over on Route 28, there's little St. Francis, the little brick church there. This is St. Januarius that's out in Renton. What's interesting is they originally celebrated Mass on the second floor of the company store. And that's where they held their Mass. In 1952, they finally had saved enough money to build a church. So they began construction of this church here. They literally built the church themselves. The brick masons laid the brick. The plumbers from the mine would come and install the plumbing. The electricians would come over, do the electricians, carpenters. They would all do that after hours and on the weekends. And they built the church as they could afford it. The first Mass was celebrated in 1953, and when they did, it was basically just 4 walls, cylinder block walls. They had no pews, they had no carpeting, they had no plaster. And they would have pancake breakfasts and pork dinners and raise money and complete the church as they went. It took them 50 years to complete the church. They celebrated their 50th anniversary in 2002, and that was the year they finally got air conditioning. So it took 50 years. But what's interesting, in 1968, they were able to afford stained glass windows. They had just plain windows in there. And this is one of the windows from the church. It's a coal miner. And you can see the coal miner and his wife, and this is to honor the people who built the church. And I just think that's a really neat tribute to the people who built the church. So the coal mining towns are still there. If you take a drive out in the country, you'll see the homes that were once thriving villages. After the Second World War, the coal mining companies decided that they no longer wanted to be in the real estate business. So they sold off the houses to the miners, and they sold them at discount prices. They gave them opportunity to buy their house. And again, the American dream. You know, an immigrant, a poor immigrant came here, and he was finally able to buy a house. And so thankful that he had that opportunity. Also what they did, once they sold off the houses, the streets, the sidewalks, the parks that were in these company towns, they turned those over to the townships, the municipalities. So then the borough, you know, Plum Borough came in, they installed utilities, paved the streets, sewers, things like that. Parks were turned over as part of the community. And so they were integrated into the larger community. So you can take a ride anywhere around here and you'll see these communities still there. Some of them have additions that have been put on, some are still the same, but you go to Newfield, Renton, Indianola, Harmer, they're all there. A lot of cases, the company stores are still there. However, there are other uses, you know, they warehouse, little business, small business, but you'd be surprised how many of the company stores are still intact. And of course, the churches are still there. You know, people from the other part of the boroughs have started to join those churches. This man here, they said that most coal miners had 3 pictures in their house. They couldn't afford art, but they had a picture of FDR, the Pope, and John L. Lewis. And it was under the leadership of John Lewis that the United Mine Workers really gained the strength that they were able to demand and get better pay, better benefits, and better working conditions from the coal companies. He was the one that really had consolidated power and was able to finally get these miners the rights that they deserved. These are just a few of the communities as they are now. There's Harmer across the way there, Renton, Newfield, Russellton, and Harwick. So you can see the houses are still there, still have most of the flavor they had before. You know, they're still communities. And what's interesting, when I lived out in Plum, we lived right near Renton and got to know a lot of people from Renton and a lot of the old timers. And they really had, they loved their town. You know, that's their heritage, and they had a lot of good community spirit from those towns. This is my family. That's my grandfather on the left, my great-grandfather in the center, and my great-great-grandfather. They were all blacksmiths in the mine. They worked over at Harmerville. That's how we ended up in this area here. My grandfather eventually left the mine and went to work down at Edgewater, but he always said he felt safer in the mine than he ever did in the mill, you know. And they say mining is something that you'll never learn to like it. You either love it the first time you go in or you hate it, but you can never learn to be a coal miner. In 2009, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, this is a monument to the local coal miners. This was through the efforts of the residents of Harmerville, this sculpture. And this is on Freeport Road. If you know where the Harmer Fire Department is, right there near the dam, this is right in front. And so it's a very nice monument. If you have a chance, I know usually when you're driving down through there, you know, you speed right by there, but it's worth stopping and take a look at. It's really a nice monument to the coal miners of our area. Now, if you're interested, I have 2 books that I highly recommend that really will give you what it was like to live in a coal mining town. This one here is called Miner Injustice, The Ragman's War. Now, this is the second printing of it. The original printing was called The Bloody Bucket. And I don't know if the author thought that was a little gruesome of a title, so they changed the name. But this is a historical fiction. It takes place over in Russellton, Pennsylvania, around 1910. And it includes a lot of true people, places, and events that happened. And then the author weaves in a murder mystery. But if you want to get a flavor for what it was like to live in a coal mining town, this is an excellent read for you. And you can pick this up on Amazon. And I don't know if the library has a copy or not, but highly recommend this book here. And then this one here is called Our Coal Mining Heritage, Harmerville, PA. And this was put together by a group of people who were coal miners and descendants of coal miners over in Harmerville. Again, an excellent, a lot of personal stories, pictures of what it was like to live in Harmerville. And this is all true in here. And I think the library has a copy of this. I don't know if it's still for sale or not. They sold this to raise money for that, so there still may be some out. But these two books are good reads if you're interested in what it was like to live in the coal mining town. All right. Well, I thank you all for coming.
I was born one morning when the sun didn't shine. I picked up my shovel and I walked to the mine. I loaded 16 tons of number 9 coal, and the straw boss said, well, bless my soul, you load 16 tons. What do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.